Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Between the Pillars, the Fisher Library's video podcast series, where we get to learn a little bit about the people that work at the Fisher, learn about some of the collections, some of the well-known ones, some of the less-known ones, we get to hopefully it's a learning experience for everybody, including me. So my name is John Shoesmith. I am the outreach librarian at the Fisher Library. And just a reminder, there's only 2 of these left for this season. This is the penultimate episode. We're into June already. So we'll be doing one today. We'll be doing one in 2 weeks. And then we're going to be taking a sabbatical through the summer so we can all rest up. We can get ready for the get ready for September, when hopefully, with things trending in the way they are, that we will be opening to the public again. So with brand new doors as well, which will be something exciting for us. So in the meantime, let me introduce you to my colleague, PJ Carefoote. He is the head of Rare Books and Special Collections. Been doing that job for how long now, PJ?
5 years.
5 years, but
between interim and official, yes, 5 years.
But you actually go back how many years now? You're the longest tenured librarian at the Fisher.
I am now in my 20th year.
20th year. So actually, maybe you could just, because PJ is also the first repeat guest on Between the Pillars. We had him on here. Some of you might remember he did our special holiday themed one back in December. But we didn't get to talk too much about you, PJ, because we went right to showing the material. So maybe, so you've been at the Fisher now for 20 years, but you have a very interesting history prior to Fisher.
I do. I have what one used to call a classical education, which meant you did all the standard English, history, math, sciences, Latin, that sort of thing. Right. And then I went on and got a degree in theology and was ordained as a priest. And
you're the second priest we've had on then.
Yes, that's right. Yes, Michael and I have a lot in common. And I served as a priest here in Canada for 2 years, and then I served in Belgium for another 4 years, I guess it was. And then I came back here and realized that it was probably time for a change. And the change amounted to moving back into education. Right. So both between teaching and getting my degree as a library science, as we called it then, in library science. And I was very, very lucky to be in Richard, as so many of us who have done these episodes, had found myself in Richard Landon's wonderful Rare Books class. And at the end of it, as only you could do 20 years ago, which you probably can't get away with now, he said to me, "So what are you planning on doing when you finish this?" And I figured I'd be, a school librarian or something like that. And he said to me, "Well, would you like to come work here?" Which, of course, today you could never get away with. Now, I still had to go through a process, but I was very lucky and have been almost the last 20 years. Originally, I was doing the medieval manuscripts and early books, cataloging them. And that's what I did up until 5 years ago. I continued doing that. And really, the medieval manuscripts only for, I guess, until 2 or 3 years ago, when we hired Tim Perry, whom some of you will remember from a few weeks back. So it's been, I was very lucky, because in my early years here, and as I think even when you came, John, some of the originals were still on site. Luba Frostaki was still here. Mary Garbillon was still here. They were still the ones that had all the Tom Reed, of course, who's pretty close to beginning. They had all the stories, and it was great to have that treasury of history that was all around us all the time. So you're going to have to keep that going now.
I was actually once the youngest person on staff at the Fisher, when I first started as a student in 2005. So I can no longer claim that anymore.
Sadly, time marches on, John.
But you are my longest tenured.
That's right. That's right.
My longest standing colleague,
that's right. Yes,
it's great that
that's exactly.
You've been probably one of my longest colleagues ever. So
well, there you go. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, no, people don't leave the Fisher. We stay for a long time.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but we're not going to talk medieval manuscripts today. We're not going to talk about early books. We're going to talk about Irish literature.
Right.
And maybe you could sort of tell us first, before we start doing the show and tell portion, why did you choose this particular topic?
Well, I'm a very proud Irish descendant on both of my parents' side. My father's family was from County Wicklow. My mother's family is from County Clare. The Irish literature, Irish tradition, Irish dysfunction are all part of my life,
Right.
and I've always had a great passion for the stories that the Irish have been able to tell so very, very well.
Right.
And so one of the things that I loved, one of the first things that Richard showed me when I came to the Fisher was the DeLury Collection, which is a collection of Irish literature. It's always been one of my favorites. It was always my hope that someone might be interested in doing an exhibition on it someday. I still hope that that will be the case, because there's some remarkable treasures in the DeLury Collection. So that's the origin of my interest. I did Celtic studies when I was an undergraduate. I think that also informed it. So it was it's always been very much a part of my identity.
And one of the reasons why we chose to do this in June is because we're coming up to this very special day, June 16th. So maybe you could actually share your screen at this point.
Sure. Yes, exactly.
We can talk about June 16th.
Yes. So does that come up now? There we go. Yes. So as you say, the 16th of June is considered in Irish literary circles, they even call it a holy day rather than a holiday. The 16th of June is Bloomsday. And Bloomsday has been celebrated. The first reference we get to Bloomsday is 1924. So it's been around for a long time. Bloomsday, the 16th of June, commemorates the romantic side of it. This is the day that the great James Joyce, who you see here, the picture of him here. I should go to the full. I'll go to this. That makes it a little. James Joyce, the great Irish author, early 20th century, part of the Irish Revival. It was on June 16th that he first took out his wife-to-be, a woman who has the great name Nora Barnacle. I mean, it's almost like it's a name that he made up for as a character, but that was her name, Nora Barnacle. And he ran into her outside the gates of Trinity College. And in I think it was 1904, it was early in the 20th century. And she thought he was a Norwegian sailor, and he didn't disabuse her of that idea. And they ended up going out on a date. And at any rate, he immortalizes this date, the 16th of June, in his arguably the most famous novel that he ever produced, Ulysses, which was published in 1922. So as we were just discussing before we started doing this, next year will of course be the 100th anniversary. And Bloomsday has been marked ever since in all around the world, not just the English-speaking world. And it's a day on which people dress up in the costume of the period. They, in a normal year, they would gather together in large numbers for readings from Ulysses, to do walking tours. If you were in Dublin, you do walking tours. And what you're doing is you were following the path of the main character from Ulysses, who is a man named Leopold Bloom, hence Bloomsday. And you follow him over the course of that one day, which is all Ulysses is. It's all takes place on the 16th of June. And so even here in Toronto, as you can see, we've been having Bloomsday here in Toronto for 36 years. Wow. And it will be held virtually again this year on the 16th. The hope, of course, is that next year, Bloomsday can go back to normal. But I really encourage anyone who's interested in Irish literature and that tradition, look at the Toronto Bloomsday Festival site, because there's some really interesting things on it of celebrations of Irish literature that will happen on that day. I didn't realize that the city of Toronto actually named a lane down in the beach called Bloomsday Lane, and they named that about 2 years ago. I had no idea that was the case.
Interesting.
So that's the origin of it's a celebration of Ulysses, but it's not just that. They celebrate anything to do with Irish literature. And as you can see, John, you might be interested in this particularly, because as you can see this year, they'll be doing readings from Finnegan's Wake, which should be very interesting to hear.
I'm not quite sure how that would work in a public setting, but
it might be worth checking out just to see see what the case is.
Yes.
So so that's the origin of the festival. And the Fisher, of course, because the DeLury Collection is very extensive, probably one of the best, if not the best collection of Irish revival literature, certainly in Canada and probably in I think arguably North America.
I would say so too.
We have multiple editions of Ulysses, beginning of course with let's see if we can beginning of course with the first edition. And here you can see we have several copies of the first edition. Some have been bound, but this is in the original wrappers, which, as you know, we always love to get the original of these sorts of things. So one of our copies is in its original wrappers. If anyone is, I will admit right now, I have tried to read Ulysses. I cannot get past the first few pages of it. It requires a greater mind than mine.
Yes.
But what it is effectively is a retelling from an Irish perspective of the story of the Odyssey, and except all compact into one day, and it's told hour by hour. And so the Fisher has several different editions of this. Two of the more interesting ones is this one from the Folio Society that came out in 1998, and it has these really beautiful gold and black etchings that were done by an Italian engraver named Mimo Palladino. It's not based on the 1922 edition, however. It's based on the 1926 edition, which is the second edition, which kind of gives, that in itself is pretty interesting, because as often unintelligible as the story can be, it obviously was popular enough that they were able to do a second edition of it.
Yeah.
And so this is based on that second edition, the 1926, with these really quite beautiful etchings, golden black etchings. One of the other interesting illustrated editions of Ulysses is the one that came out in 2013, and it has these beautiful illustrations that begin each of the hours of the day that you walk through with Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom. And one of the reasons this one is interesting is because the 2013 edition of Ulysses was actually the first one to be printed in Ireland. So up to that point, it had never been printed in Ireland. I think we have to understand one of the reasons was that this book was banned like pretty much everywhere. It was offensive to people because it was very graphic in terms of biology, sexuality, stuff like that. So the book got banned. There's one really interesting story actually that goes along with that. The Americans banned, in 1922, when the book came out, the Americans banned Ulysses immediately. Canada was a little bit slower. And so the story is told that apparently the Canadians, the way the book got into the United States was boats came over from the American side of New York State, and Canadians met them halfway around, I guess, the international border, and they passed cases of Ulysses from boat to boat as though it were like a gin shipment. And that's how Ulysses did get its way into the United States illicitly. But that's how much this book got people really quite upset.
And for those who are interested that have been to Paris, or might have been to the Shakespeare and Company bookstore, the original, the bookstore has since moved from its original location, but the actual book itself, the original imprint, was Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare and Company bookstore.
Exactly, as was the second edition. Yeah, it couldn't have been printed. The Irish would never have allowed this to have been printed, but the French certainly had no problem with it. Yeah.
The great thing too, just to interrupt you, is that I mean, we have these great editions as well, but we can even track the history of its publication by looking at some of the literary journals that it was first excerpted in as well. So which go back, a number of years prior to the publication of the book in 1922.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean that's one of the great things about a special collections library is that you will collect around a strength, and this is a perfect example of that sort of thing. John knows better than anybody because some of these books, of course, were very popular with Marshall McLuhan, particularly Finnegan's Wake. But these ones, as opposed to Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is a very accessible book, and I think one of the most moving of Joyce's works. This and Finnegan's Wake give that stream of consciousness style that Joyce becomes so famous for, but you've got to be more patient with it than someone like I am. But it clearly has its devotees,
Yes,
no question of that.
For sure.
So here you can see another example. You can see it's by time that you move your way through the day. But why we this is really an entree to be able to talk about the collection itself, the DeLury Collection of Irish literature. And so here you have, this is a painting of DeLury that is in the Fisher Library. I hope it always will hang in the Fisher Library because it's important for us in terms of our history. The very first collection that came into the Fisher Library in 1955, after the department was established in that very year, was DeLury's collection. And there's correspondence in the University of Toronto archives talking about how the then head of the library, Blackburn, Mr. Blackburn, was so excited that this collection was coming, and he asked that the books be able to be kept in behind the glass cases that were in Professor DeLury's office until our new Department of Special Collections can open. And so historically, then, DeLury's collection is important to us, just as arguably the foundational collection of all of the many hundreds of special collections that we have in the building. And here you see him. He's a really interesting. He and his family are a really interesting character. He was born, as you can see, before Confederation, in a little place called Manila, Ontario, which is not far from Lindsay. And he was a little farmhouse. His parents had immigrated to Canada from Ireland. His father was a Catholic. His mother was a Methodist, which is an interesting combination in and of itself, which may also explain why in the 1901 census, when he and his brothers, who were then living together down around the university campus, had to declare their religion, all four of them put down no religion. Which is a very, very odd thing in 1901 to find on the census record. That just was not done. So his father, as I say, Daniel, his mother, Catherine, they must have been interesting people in and of themselves, because just judging by the way they named their kids, one of them is clearly an Irish nationalist. I'm guessing the father, who was from the Republic, but I can't prove that, because two of their sons, one is named Daniel O'Connell DeLury. If anybody knows anything about Irish history, Daniel O'Connell is the great liberator of the Irish Catholics. And another one is named Justin Scarsfield DeLury. And in the 19th century, Patrick Scarsfield was like the great hero of the Irish diaspora. He was someone who fought against William of Orange during the conquest of Ireland. So two of the sons have that name, but the other two have names like this one, Alfred Tennyson DeLury, and the other son is Ralph Waldo Emerson DeLury. So clearly, one of them was really, really into literature, and the other one was really, really into patriotism. My guess is that it's split down on religious lines, the father on the ones that were the patriots and the mother on the one, but I can't prove that, and we will never be able to prove it. The names themselves are just absolutely fascinating. He graduated from U of T, and he had a bachelor's degree from U of T in 1890, and he went off and taught mathematics for 2 years. And he was really torn. You can tell from the accounts at the time and some of his correspondence, he was really torn between whether he wanted to teach math or whether he wanted to teach literature. And in the end, he came down on the side for math. But then in 1892, he comes back to U of T and he begins teaching mathematics. And he was very good at it. He wrote his own geometry textbooks, which are in the Fisher collection as well. And in 1922, so the year that Ulysses gets published, he becomes the dean of the Faculty of Arts for the university and remains in that capacity until his retirement. So he taught mathematics, he was a dean, but in fact, his real passion was Irish literature, and specifically Irish literature of the revival period. And one of the ways that that's evidence is this bookplate that that it shows up in all the books that are his. For us at the Fisher, it's interesting because if you look in the very left corner, you can see that the engraving has been signed A.S. Carter, Alexander Scott Carter, who was one of the great designers, illustrators, designers in Toronto in that period in the early 20th century. And a lot of buildings around Toronto bear evidence of his work, coats of arms that he designs, all this kind of stuff. So he is the designer of this according to the specifications that DeLury wanted. And you can see it's a very, very Irish bookplate, the Irish harp, the Irish lettering, all of that. And then he sends this overseas, and he gets it engraved by Emery Walker. And again, for anyone who's into 20th century and that whole movement that comes after Morris, Emery Walker is one of the founders of the Doves Press. And so he is the one that actually creates the engraving plate from which these are made. And one of the great things in his DeLury's collection is we have his correspondence where he talks about the plates being made and the paper that it's going to be put on, and it's just an amazing thing.
Wow,
really is. What happens? And again, sometimes you have to read between the lines. He gets 1,000 of these book plates made in 1915, and we know at that point that he doesn't have that many books.
Right.
The very next year, he orders another 1,000. So he's got 2,000 book plates by 1916, which is a clear indication that this man was serious about beginning and building a collection of Irish literature that would be second to none, and he does. I mean, we have these little handwritten catalogs that tell us what he is buying, when he's buying it, why it's important. Here you can see I got a second copy in 1919. These books that are all in his collection, just an amazing resource that informs us about that period that was around really until almost to the end of the 20th century, of what it was to be what I would call the gentleman book collector.
Right.
The person, much like our former director, late director Richard Landon, who spends time poring over catalogs, but here he documents everything, and it's so important for us to understand in terms of how special collections emerge.
So I mean, did he really focus in exclusively on Irish literature, or does he go? Okay.
No. Well, he does at the end. Well, I'll mention that he does get into fairy tales, which are beyond Irish. But in terms of what he actually collects, it's works of the Irish literary revival. And so that means that we're talking about people, his main focus is Yeats. Mm-hmm. That's clearly his love. And he becomes friends with Yeats and Yeats's family. And so we have correspondence in his archive of letters going back and forth between him and the family. He buys, Yeats's brother is Jack Butler Yeats, who was one of the great visual artists of this period. And DeLury buys his paintings. We're told that if their descriptions of his apartment, he had an apartment on what was then called St. Albans Street, which is now that part of Wellesley Street, just when you turn from Queen's Park going east. That was St. Albans Street. And he had an apartment there, probably now where one of the Ontario government buildings is. But they say that when you went there, the walls were lined with bookcases of Irish literature and Jack Butler Yeats's painting. So he is a truly committed Irish patriot. And yet he's also very clear, he doesn't want to get caught up in the nationalist arguments of the day. I think it's pretty clear he supports the revolution, all that, but he works very hard not to get drawn into it. But yeah, so some of the things in his collection, the Yeats that we see here, the 1916, his famous, this incredibly rare copy, there are only, I think, about 20 copies of Easter 1916, and DeLury gets one of them. This which has become the iconic reflection of the Easter Rising of 1916 that eventually leads to Irish independence. And here, as I say, here's a book that is being presented to DeLury as a Christmas present in 1917 by Yeats's sister, Elizabeth, who is also a printer in her own right. Fascinating. But it isn't just, he also has these incredibly rare documents from the time of the Revolution. Like, for example, it's rare to the point of non-existent newspaper that was published on the 2 days after the day after the Irish Rebellion, Easter Monday of 1916. He has a copy of this. It's almost impossible to find it in any library anywhere else.
Wow.
And he not only collects the great names like, you know, Synge and Lady Gregory and Shaw. He's got a lot of Shaw. He has Oscar Wilde, although Oscar Wilde's a little early for the Irish Revival. Joyce, of course. Mm-hmm. He also is a very committed collector of the the female writers of the period of the Irish Revival. And so here you have Dora Sigerson, who's one of them. But he also collected Jane Barlow, who was another great writer of the period, Lady Gregory, whom I've already mentioned. So he really is committed to not just the Yeats as important as they are. He really wanted to have a cross section of all of the great Irish authors of this period. Say we're talking the 19 teens through to the 1930s. And then, as you say, does he get into other things? He does. He does collect fairy tales. And that's not something, as you know, we would normally collect at the Fisher. That's you'd expect at the Osborne down the street. But because it was part of DeLury's collection, he had a good eye for them. They were in interesting bindings, or they had really good illustrations, or he just, as he did with all of his books, he had a really good eye. And they go beyond the Irish stories. You see here, he's collecting Hungarian, Slavic. He collected anything. And I think it gets at the heart of who DeLury was. DeLury loved a good story. Mm. And so whether that story was, you know, Irish or what, he was up for collecting it. And so that's what you see that's going on here. But I think in the end, what makes him really interesting is that marriage of his archive and his library.
Well, especially the archive itself, because I mean, we take it for granted in this day and age when we're sourcing materials. We can just look them out on the internet and find dealers that way. I mean, in terms of the early 20th century and mid 20th century book collecting, I mean, it must have been so much more of a journey to track so much of this material down.
Absolutely. And so you'll see in his correspondence when he writes to, and he's dealing with book dealers in the States and England and on the continent, not so much in Canada. But he's dealing with all these people, and he's not ordering one book. He's ordering 10. He's ordering 20. And I think he's doing it because he knows, because we have the return correspondence, he knows that of those 20 that he's requesting, he might get 10.
Right.
And because there is this, you know, we forget the early 20th century, there is this real competition for first editions, for important editions of books. And he's right there in the middle of this fight, and happily he documents the whole thing.
Do you get a sense? I mean, I haven't looked at the collection extensively, but do you get a sense of sort of the readability of some of these things, like whether the spines are broken or whether he just sort of kept them in pristine condition as much as he could?
So he was pretty much insistent that he was going for the pristine copy when he was ordering them. But it is clear that he read the books. You can tell from looking at them. The corners are rubbed. The pages are. You can see. You know how often you can see where a thumbprint has left itself on the bottom right hand corner of the page. These books. I mean, did he read all of them? I doubt he read all of them. Right. But he certainly was committed to having the library. And I'm quite certain, I mean, he knew his literature because he was interviewed regularly by newspapers about Irish literature, about Irish plays. He reviewed Irish plays as some of the Abbey Theatre troupes came from Dublin to Toronto in the teens and the 20s, and he hosted them. So he may not have read everything, but he certainly was au courant on everything that was coming out of the Irish Revival for sure.
One of the things we were talking about earlier too, prior to starting the recording, was that DeLorean, in some respects, is not an atypical collector that we have at the Fisher. As you say, he taught math, yet he has this extensive collection of Irish literature. We have other collections in our library, other collectors that you wouldn't think naturally would morph into and an area of specialty.
Absolutely.
Joseph Urbant's a good one. I mean, Joseph Urban, with our Alice collection, he was, he was a lawyer or a businessman.
Yeah, and our philosophy collection. It has been developed by most graciously and given to us by a banker. That was his background. Professor Stanton, who was one of the leading lights of computer at the beginning of computer science. He collected Portuguese literature. This is so many of our collections that are in the library have been the fruit of a love of something other than just the thing the person did for a living. So it's their avocation that ends up, in a way, living on in their gift. And also there are other professors who along the way have given collections that do represent their area of specialization. So, for example, Milton Buchanan, our wonderful collection of Spanish and Italian. That comes out of his area, truly his area of interest. Stillman Drake, another one whose interest was in astronomy, Galileo. So, it's an interesting combination of who collectors were, that some of them collected in terms of what they loved, but not necessarily what they did, and others had them both at the same time. But the Fishers got all those. The collections, that's why it's special collections. It's just incredible.
And these aren't static collections either. I mean, I just purchased a Finnegan's Wake that will fit naturally into the DeLury collection. I mean, maybe talk a bit about that as well.
That's right. Yeah. So, depending on the terms of the will, like for example, Professor DeLury, there was an actual will that gave all of his books to the library. His mathematical books were hived off. He had a very strong mathematical, not surprising, working library, which went to the Department of Mathematics. I have no idea what happened to it after that. But anyway, according to the terms of his will, it was possible for us to continue to add to his collection as time went on. A few collections are closed, they can't be added to, but Professor DeLury's was one that we can add to. So for example, that incredible Finnegan's Wake, which is going to be revealed to us in the next issue of Halcyon, will find its natural home with all of the other editions of Finnegan's Wake, because that's what Professor DeLury wanted. He wanted to make sure that Irish revival literature, as it continued to be published, would be represented in his holdings.
That's great. That's great. Well, PJ, this has been great. Maybe you can stop sharing. We can just have a little chat at the very end here. I'm curious now, you'll be retiring one day. Do you think you'll ever sort of try to tackle Ulysses?
I should say yes, shouldn't I? But I've tried it like 2 or 3 times, and I only get so far, and I find my mind wanders like Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom's does, and maybe that's what Joyce wanted. I don't know. Maybe I'll find the discipline to be able to do that.
I always joke that probably the easiest way to read it is to read maybe a McLuhan copy, because he heavily annotated them, and then this way we can follow.
Which helps you understand.
Yes, maybe we can follow along, read behind McLuhan as he's.
Well, maybe someday someone will come up with the idea of doing an annotated version of it using McLuhan's notes, and then that gets added to the DeLury collection, which would be great.
Exactly.
It's part of the creativity that is all represented in what we have, with so many people working on our materials in the library. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, PJ. This has been great. A perfect compliment to Bloomsday coming up. Anybody watching this at any time, please hoist the Guinness at the same time.
I was going to say, at least have a Guinness on the 16th. Yeah, at the very least.
Because it seems to be the appropriate thing to do. So again, thanks for bringing us to the DeLury collection. Just a reminder, we have one more to go of these, and in a couple of weeks we'll be going to do a special Gay Pride themed episode. So hopefully that's going to be really exciting for us to see. So thanks again, PJ.
Thank you.
For everybody else, please enjoy the weekend. Tell your friends about these podcasts, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time.